So welcome everyone to the first VCLS webinar of 2024. I am Emmanuelle Osage, working as a regulatory scientist at VCLS, and it's my pleasure to host and moderate today's webinar on getting an early access program off the ground safely. First of all, here's a brief introduction of our speakers today, so Hayley and Adeline. Adeline is the director of the clinical operation. She has a deep understanding of program management principles and regulatory requirements. Adeline actively engages with key stakeholders to guarantee the compliant execution of early access program objectives. And Hayley leads the Health Authority Admin, QPPV Office and Vigilance Regulatory Surveillance team at VCLS. Hayley's extensive vigilance experience spans both the clinical and post-market spheres of drug development. PV for early access programs, being a gray area between the clinical and the post-market, comes easily to Hayley thanks to her strong grasp on the requirements and recommendations in both settings. Before presenting the agenda of this webinar, please note that the webinar will last approximately 1 hour and with 10 to 15 minutes for questions and answers. During this presentation, if you have any questions, please feel free to send them through the chat and we will address them during our Q&A session. The replay will be available on our website shortly after the live session. This presentation will start by presenting briefly what is an early access program, and then the framework and the challenges of such programs. Then a focus will be made on pharmacovigilance before switching to a case study. Before Adeline introduces what is an EAP, we would like to ask you if you are familiar with EAP. So there is the poll here. So I'm waiting a little bit for everyone to answer. So whether you are familiar with EAP or not, please don't hesitate to ask us questions and we will address them at the end of the session.
Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Let's kick off this meeting with some definition. What is an EAP? So EAP means early access program, but can also be called compassionate use program, named patient program, specials, and so on and so forth. All these names are referring to the same concept. And when it comes to early access program, the tricky part is that there is no one single rule or one unique regulation. Nevertheless, we can find on the EMA website a generic definition on what is a compassionate use. And basically, it's a program dedicated for patients who in needs, meaning that there are no satisfactory treatments for them. They are not eligible for clinical trials, and there are no other alternatives. We are often dealing here with rare disease, life-threatening, long-lasting, or seriously debilitating illnesses. And these EAP programs, they offer ethical, compliance, and control mechanism to get an access to investigational products outside of clinical trials and before the commercial launch of the drug. So why setting up these early access programs? What are the benefits? The primary goal should be the patient benefit, meaning that the patient should be at the center of this program. It's a way to get them an access to a promising, an innovative treatment, which aims to improve their outcomes and potentially extend their survival. So really, patient is at the center. But pharmaceutical companies, they have also some opportunities when it comes to early access programs, especially by early engaging with key opinion leaders and patient communities. because they will provide the physician, the future prescribers, with a treatment which is unapproved. It's a way to build a larger network, a new network of prescribers, and involve future advocates. It's also an opportunity to foster trust and collaboration. And because, in some extent, the AP applicant will collect data on safety and also deal with the patient condition, it helps to understand these unmet needs and get a better, as well, understanding of these patient living conditions. So again, as it will involve future prescribers, patients dealing with rare disease, it's a way to help shaping guidelines in the futures and develop recommendations, particularly when it comes to rare diseases. Now that we have described what is an early access program, let's dig into the EAP framework, and we will also share with you some practical challenges. Early access programs are not clinical trials, meaning that the aim is not to collect data. It's not for investigational. But there is a way to collect some data. We focus on safety data. In the sense that it means that real-world evidence will be collected from patients who are not in clinical trials and from various geographies. We already mentioned it before, but the key part is that there are early interactions with regulatory authorities and payers. And in some cases, there are also potentially potential revenues that can be generated with EAPs. Nevertheless, all these EAP, they need resources and they have a cost, because they are involving multiple stakeholders, from medical affairs, regulatory, marketing, market access, supply chain, and not to forget pharmacovigilance. It has a cost also because the products are often provided free of charge to patients. And more and more we can see that the physicians and also the site staff, they are compensated for the work done during these early access programs. Don't get afraid with these very busy slides, but the aim is to show you that there is this huge heterogeneities across the countries around the world. And we chose the example of 4 countries: Italy, Spain, UK, and US. And you can see that in 4 countries, there are different names when it comes to early access programs. In Italy, it's called the compassionate use. In Spain, we have medicines under special situations. In the UK, we have specials and also early access medicine scheme. And in the US, it's called expanded access. In all of these countries, we have different laws, decrees, regulations, or guidelines. And these programs are available most of the time before the marketing authorizations, but they can also happen after the marketing authorization, such as in Spain. I also have in mind France, when these programs apply both before and marketing authorization. In all of these countries, EAPs are available for individual, meaning on a named patient basis, but also for a group of patients, what is called cohorts. And even more, in the US, we have individual, emergency use, intermediate size, and so forth. In terms of requirements, regulatory requirements, each of these countries, they have different rules. In Italy, we can see that the product should be approved abroad, or clinical trials should have been conducted beforehand. In Spain, most of the time, they are conducted in hospital settings. In the UK, completely different process when it comes to EAMS, the Early Access Medicine Scheme, because it's a 2-step process, which starts first with the PIM designation, which is basically a way to show that the drug is, the treatment is innovative, that there is an unmet need. So you have to show this first, to complete this first step first, and then request for a scientific opinion. In the US, the FDA governs this process, and IRB approvals are also needed. And there are more. In terms of data, safety is is collected as a routine data routinely during EAPs. But in some of these countries, there is also dedicated protocol for EAP, which allows the company to collect some efficacy data in a limited way, but it's still possible. So we describe what is an EAP, what are the regulatory requirements, and so now how to maximize the EAP success. The key point is really to plan all the activities as early as possible, because you will have to involve multiple stakeholders. All the trainings, learnings that can be anticipated should be anticipated. The patient is at the center of this process, so patients should be empowered. Some data will be collected, in particular safety, so your safety team should be involved as early as possible as well. And because the product will be provided to the sites, to the patients, the supply chain needs to be also involved in the first steps. Again, this is not a clinical trial. The product is still not marketed, but you will collect some data that may impact the benefit risk. So there is a need for a constant reevaluation. In terms of documentation, when it comes to early access programs, the framework is still unclear. Are we dealing with good vigilance practices, good clinical practices? There is no clear rule on that part, but it doesn't prevent the pharmaceutical companies to keep the documentation available and ready in case of any inspection audits.
Thanks very much, Adeline, for that introduction to early access programs and their implementation. So you mentioned safety a lot during your presentation, and I'd like to do a dive into the pharmacovigilance challenges that we can encounter in early access programs. So I'm going to start with Europe. There do exist European guidelines which are applicable to all member states, which state that once the company has applied for the early access program to one specific member state, these member states may contact the EMA for an opinion and recommendation on this specific program. The EMA can then come back with an opinion and recommendation, which can include information on specific safety monitoring. So this could be something like the requirement for a PSUR on a specific frequency, or the need to collect a specific type of safety report. But keep in mind that the requirements do remain individual per member state, as explained by Adeline, both to apply for your early access program, but also to perform pharmacovigilance. So if there is no EMA opinion or recommendation, the individual requirements per member state will need to be followed for PV. The good news is that there is a little bit of harmonization, and in general, for most European countries, we do submit ICSRs via EV-Human, which is definitely a plus when it comes to thinking about each individual EU member state. But I will have a look in a little bit more detail into the specific requirements per a few different member states in our next slide. Moving on to the UK guidelines. So these are the most similar to EU guidelines, but now they are indeed separate since Brexit. And there's a similar approach with the submission of the ICSRs to their main ICSR portal. We can also use the gateway. Moving now to US, where there is a completely different approach in PV, because most early access programs are applied for via an investigational new drug application. So when we're talking about PV, we're going to be following pre-market rules. So just as if it was a clinical trial in place in terms of collection of safety data. There's also the option to apply for individual patient use, and I'll go through the PV requirements for that in the next slide. Something that is important to keep in mind when implementing your EAP, and something that Adeline did mention during her presentation, is the implementation of a protocol. Because of the patient population for rare diseases, there can be specific needs for safety data collection. And in order to make sure that healthcare professionals are submitting all the safety data that's required by the company, these can be listed in the EAP protocol. So we're talking about the requirements in a little bit more detail now. So here I've listed 4 countries, slightly different to Adeline's mix, because I really wanted to show the vast differences between some European countries and then the non-European countries as well. So as you can see, the first 2 European countries, Italy and France, have a couple of similarities. As I've stated previously, sending ICSRs to EV human, so in line with our post-marketing rules in Europe. Not as much a requirement, but an ethical need for a medical information service. So as soon as a product is put into circulation outside of a clinical trial, we need to be able to inform patients about the product. So the implementation of a medical information service is really important at this point. When we come to France, we could see that there are a couple more requirements, including something very specific called an exploitant, which is a separate entity to the actual pharmaceutical company. And it's an entity that is implanted in France and is in charge of basically distributing and taking care of pharmacovigilance for the product in France in a very summarized way. Connected to this exploitant is the local person for pharmacovigilance, so an RPV it is called. And it's kind of, well, I mean, it's exactly what you would put in place for your post-marketing PV. But it needs to start being in place in France as soon as the product is available outside of a clinical trial. In France, there's also a need for a periodic summary report, which is submitted every 6 months. So moving on to UK, as stated, the ICSRs are submitted in line with post-marketing rules via the portal, Medical Information Service. And then once we get, if you're applying for your early access program via the EAMS scheme, you will need, and when you're applying for your scientific opinion, you will need to provide your full pharmacovigilance system, so your pharmacovigilance system master file. So this is definitely getting more into a post-market territory in terms of pharmacovigilance requirements. And then we move on to the US. So if you're applying via your investigational new drug application, you'll need to submit safety reports to the FDA and your IRB, as well as your annual safety report. So very similar as to what you would do in a clinical trial. If you are submitting via individual patient access, there's just one point in time when you'd be needing to submit safety data, which is coming at the end of the treatment, along with the results that you would send to the FDA for the treatment period. So as Adeline stated, there are a multitude of resources that are required to pilot an early access program. So really, when you are setting up your EAP, a transversal approach is key, not only for the implementation, but also for the PV aspects. Because as I mentioned, we need to start thinking about PV from the very writing of the protocol. So a transversal approach will enable you to optimize your PV throughout the product cycle. You're going to be able to ensure you have your 360-degree knowledge in place from the implementation through to the PV maintenance of your program. It will allow for local presence for countries where it's required, such as France. You'll be able to ensure that you have a robust QMS, which is just as important in an early access program as for your clinical trial and in post-market. You'll be able to implement adapted safety reporting tools because you'll be able to understand the needs from the very implementation of the program and adapt your safety reporting tools, which may not need to be as scaled up as what you would implement in your post-marketing phase. And you'll be able to have a streamlined interface between your healthcare professionals and your PV team, which is really important when we're talking about rare diseases, for example, where there's such a limited patient population.
Thank you, Ellie, for this very detailed presentation. So, so we talked a lot about how to conduct, how to report the data and so on, but hopefully at some point your early access program will come to an end and it will be time to transition to the marketed product. And again, it is a critical step for your EAPs because then you will have to communicate clearly with your key stakeholders, meaning your patients, the prescribers, the caregivers, that the EAP comes to an end and that they will now be, the marketed product will now be available. You have to ensure the compliance with the regulatory requirements. And we talked a little bit about the supply chain and how to involve them at an early stage, but they still have to be involved to ensure a smooth transition between the EAP product to the commercial product. Of course, you don't have to forget to secure the reimbursement and the discussion with the healthcare systems. And because you will transition from one program to the marketed product, you have to keep in mind to develop educational materials about the commercial availability of the treatment. And not to forget the post-market surveillance, and I'm sure Ellie, you would like to comment on this.
Yes, definitely. Thanks, Adeline. So, of course, we need to implement our post-marketing PV system. And when we're talking about a rare disease, for example, in Europe, it will be a centralized authorization, so approved in all 31 European countries. And of course, in Europe, we need to start thinking about the implementation of our local PV network, which definitely requires planning, both on a resource side, but also on a budgetary side, as it's quite a large cost to consider. And we also talked about a few post-marketing aspects for the UK, like a PSMF, but of course that would definitely need to be rolled out into Europe if you are marketing in that region.
So thank you, Hayley. Before moving on to the French early access programs, we would like to ask you if you if you think that an EAP would be beneficial to your product development. So, as we have seen the benefits of an EAP presented before, we would recommend you to consider this option if your product is eligible.
Thank you, Emmanuel. So interesting to see that the eligibility of this early access program are not so straightforward, and that's a good point. It's not so straightforward. We would like to focus on the French regulation regarding early access programs. It's pretty clear nowadays that the French regulations are the most detailed one in Europe, at least I would say. And for those who are not so familiar with what's going on in France, so this new regulation came into force almost 3 years ago now. It was in July 2021, and it replaced the previous program, which were called ATU, RTU, ATU nominative, and all the multiple programs. So nowadays we have two different programs, the compassionate use and the early access, which are linked but quite different. If we start with the compassionate use, this pathway is applicable for treatment which are not intended to be marketed in the targeted indication, meaning that there is no ongoing clinical development, no marketing authorization application ongoing or planned. Basically, these programs are dedicated for one patient on an it's the former ATU nominative, the named patient program. The ANSM will be deeply involved in reviewing the efficacy and safety data that are available so far. And when they will assess the dossier, they will then grant the compassionate prescription valid for 3 years or a compassionate access authorization valid for 1 year. They can also refuse your application if they think that there is too many uncertainties in your dossier. Again, there is a link between the compassionate access authorization and the early access program, because the second one is applicable for treatments which are intended to be marketed in the targeting indication. They should be innovative, and these criteria are of interest for the HAS, which is the French HTA body. And there should be clinical data available or clinical development programs available. I mentioned it very briefly earlier during this webinar, but in France, so we have the opportunities to go for early access programs before the marketing authorization or after. In case of before marketing authorization, efficacy and safety assessment will be performed by the NSM only, meaning that after the marketing authorization, the NSM will not be involved because this assessment should have already been performed. And what is new in this regulation is that the final assessment and the decision is made by the HAS. And the French HTA body will assess some economic data, part of your EAP dossier. And at the end of the process, so the pharmaceutical company will be granted with an early access authorization, which can also be refused. It's an option. And so there are some specificities for France. We discussed a lot about the safety data collection. Of course, this is the point when it comes to early access program in France. But there are also an opportunity in France to collect more, some efficacy data in a limited way. But if there is a strong rationale for that, you can collect efficacy data. We have to use a protocol available on the ANSM website. And we have to be very careful when it comes to data collection, because the goal is to have less than 10% of missing data, meaning that as an EAP applicant and as a future marketing authorization holder, you can't be too greedy in terms of data collection. You are really to focus on what is relevant in the framework of an early access program. It is highly recommended to include patient-reported outcome measures. Again, the patient is at the center of this process, and the involvement of patient association is really a must. The great changes with this new regulation is that now we have predictable timelines, and the full process is taking like 3 months to get a feedback from the HAS at the very end of the submission. And there are also some commitments to be fulfilled by the company, such as making sure that the product is available within 2 months after the early access program is granted. You noticed in the previous slide that the Haute Autorité de Santé is now deeply involved in this process, And again, it's an opportunity to really engage early at an early stage with the payers, because in France, your product will be funded during this during the early access program. So you will generate additional revenues. So not only the NSM but also DHS will assess your data, and it means that your pricing strategy should be also defined, or at least or even ready at this stage of this EAP. So there are a lot of advantages of having an early access program in France, but there are also some risks, because the final decision is publicly available on the NHS and NSM websites. So all the decision, meaning the approval, but also the refusals, everything is available. And yeah, I already mentioned it, but the pricing strategy is key in that part. Also, the French authorities, they are often challenging the innovative part of your dossier, meaning that there are criteria to be fulfilled. They are clearly defined in the regulations, and so not only you have to prove that you are innovating in the sense that you are bringing something new, also to the patients. There is a real added value for the patients on top of a new mode of action, for instance.
So moving on to a couple of case studies, and this first one is focusing on PV obligations. But I will mention that the submission of the early access designation was also performed by our team. So it was for a French biotech targeting EU, US, and Canadian markets in a rare disease for early access designation. We did encounter a few challenges, such as the knowledge gap in local PV requirements for EAPs. So as you all may know, PV is really a strict environment, and the non-respect of rules can lead to non-compliance, which is something that is measured by the authorities. So it's definitely something to keep in mind from the very beginning. There was a need to educate stakeholders, for example, for the need for this medical information system, as well as the local people for PV in certain countries. And then due to the small patient population and the limited data collection in PV, there were limited streamlined processes available prior to implementing the program. So our approach was to accompany our clients through these mandatory local requirements so that we could ensure the correct collection, processing, and reporting of safety data in line with the regulations. We needed to adapt some general processes that were, created for clinical trials or post-marketing to fit the needs of the client, but keeping in mind the local PV requirements as well. And we needed to rapidly customize our PV system so that we could ensure uninterrupted collection of the safety data because of the unmet medical need. We needed to ensure that patients continued to receive their treatment and safety data was continuing to be collected. So the outcomes of this accompaniment were that the EAPs are currently still ongoing. So patients are benefiting from this life-changing treatment in waiting for the authorization of the product. And the safety data that we've been able to collect has improved our understanding of the product, the benefit risk profile, and we will continue to build upon this base of safety data right through marketing authorization and the post-market life cycle of the product.
Thank you, Ellie. We'd like also to share with you a second case study we had the chance to work on. So we worked with a French pharmaceutical company. They were definitely targeting the French market, and they were dealing with a rare disease. They already obtained some named patient programs, and they were like in between the two regulations, meaning that they submitted their dossier as part of the previous regulation, and it was for a cohort of patients. And they got absolutely no news from the NSM at that time. And so they came back to us for some support to try to help them to figure out what's going on. And so we were asked to switch to the new regulation. And our client was definitely not ready to submit by themselves with the new regulations because they didn't have the time to digest the regulations. So this was really the challenges that we faced at that time, because we were it was like one of the first dossiers that was submitted with this new template, with the new protocol template, the new dossier. And we were also in need to define the drug pricing strategy. So there were challenges to really tackle. And so our support was mainly to educate our client, to share with them our understanding of the processes and what needs to be done. So we developed the protocol, so the what is called the PUTRD. We included all the patient engagement and market access inputs to fulfill like the need to get patient-reported outcome measures, but also economic data in the dossier. And we help them to understand basically the steps that needs to be overcome with the French authorities. And so we managed to complete the application in quite short timelines, and we get the feedback from the DHS within 3 months as planned by the regulation. So it was the program was approved, and we were really happy to see that the patients again can benefit from this treatment, and the program actually is still ongoing, but from a post-marketing perspective nowadays.
So thank you, Hayley and Adeline. To conclude, here are the takeaway messages of today's webinar. The main consideration for the implementation of an EAP is the benefit that the patient will have from this early access to a product. For the successful implementation, careful and early planning needs to be undertaken to ensure adhesion from all required stakeholders. Also, in both the implementation of the EAP and to comply with PV requirements, regulations differ between countries and regions. In most cases, data collection is limited to safety data, but in some countries, the scope can be extended to include the collection of efficacy data, for example. And due to the nature of an EAP being for the benefit of the patient, they are often applicable for rare diseases with limited patient populations, and thus require the implementation of adapted tools and processes for data collection. And the transversal approach is key to ensure all aspects of your EAP are considered with the big picture in mind. So now that you know a bit more about EAPs, do you plan to include an EAP to your product development plan? And please also don't hesitate to ask any question you may have. So we hope that this webinar and both the case studies presented have provided you more concrete information and therefore will help you to make your decision. So it is now time for our Q&A session. As I said previously, please don't hesitate to ask any question you may have. So we received the first one. So can an EAP be promoted?
I can take this one. Thank you, Emmanuel. So, I mean, in the case of pre-approval, we are dealing with unauthorized products, so promotion is definitely forbidden. In France, for example, all DAP decisions, as I mentioned, will be publicly available on the NSM NHS website, but it's not like promotion, it's only information available also to patients. So yeah, when you are dealing with unapproved treatments, I mean, there is no way to promote it as any unmarketed product, I would say.
Okay, thank you. We have received another. So I see that an RPV is required when an EAP is conducted in France. What are the required qualifications and experience of the RPV?
I'll answer that one. So I think you're talking about the responsible person for PV in France. So basically, this person needs to be either a doctor or a pharmacist, and they need to reside in France and perform their activities in France. So the person for PV will be working with the exploitant that was mentioned earlier, and they'll basically be looking after all of the PV aspects of the product that are occurring in France. So making sure that the product in the French market, well, in the French environment remains safe.
Thank you, Hailey. So another one, you said that a protocol is required for an EAP. Is it just in France?
Thank you, Emmanuel, for this very interesting question. Actually, the protocol is not required, particularly when it comes to named patient program. That's true that when you have this dedicated protocol for your EAP, you can define exactly the amount of data you would like to collect. And it's a way also to show the competent authorities the rationale for this data collection, meaning that, okay, you will collect safety data, that's for sure. And in case you will need this efficacy or any other additional data, you can start discussing with them to justify why it's relevant to get this to obtain this data. But yeah, in France, it's clearly defined what you have to collect, part of the, because we have this template that we have to use. In the other countries, I mean, it can be discussed with the authorities, the amount of data you will need to collect.
Thank you, Adeline. So another one, if I outsource the RPV, how do I retain oversight of French PV activities?
That's a great question because a lot of people are outsourcing this role. So what we would recommend is definitely making sure that there is somebody who remains part of the pharmaceutical company, or part of the extended team, discussing with the responsible pharmacist on a regular basis, who is able to maintain a global PV system and discuss with this responsible person in France on a regular basis, making sure that any cases, any safety issues that have been identified, any literature findings, any medical information inquiries that are occurring in France are being relayed back to the global PV system and being discussed on a company level. So it's definitely important to make sure this link is clearly set up and described in your PV system master file.
Thank you, Hailey. So another question, I think this one is for Adeline. Can you clarify the difference between compassionate use and an EAP in France? For instance, is it possible to apply for compassionate use for a patient population not covered by the ongoing clinical studies?
Okay, yeah, thank you, Emmanuel. Yeah, that's a great question. So basically, the compassionate use applied for one patient, so on a named patient basis. It's most of the time driven by the physician, meaning that the process for getting it approved and review is slightly different. And the physician will connect to the web platform, which is called eSaturn in France, and they will enter the data that he has about the patient to confirm that the patient is eligible to receive the treatment. But it's done really on a named patient basis. The company, the pharmaceutical company, they will receive the notification of this request from the physician, and they will approve it or not if they judge that the patient is not eligible. But it's really the process driven by the physician on an inpatient basis. When it comes to early access programs, the process is driven by the company, by the pharmaceutical companies, and so the dossier has to be completed. It's for a group of patients, not only for one patient, and in that case, both ANSM and IHS, when it comes to unmarketed product, they will be involved. And in most of the time in early access programs, you will have this protocol, this dedicated protocol, which will apply for the named patient programs. Most of the time we don't have protocol. It can happen, we may have protocol in place, but it's less often, I would say.
Okay, thank you, Adeline. Don't hesitate if you have more questions. We have a few more minutes to go through them together.
Maybe I can come back, on the criteria to get to know if your EAP is eligible or not, because there were some concerns raised by the audience. So it's true that it depends on the countries, definitely. The key point will be to evaluate whether you have enough data to show that there is a good balance between your safety and efficacy data to prove that there is no risk for the patient, basically. And we focused a lot on France, but in France, so there are 5 criteria that will be assessed by the ANSM and the HAS during the early access program, not the named patient program, really the early access programs. The one that is assessed by the ANSM is the efficacy and safety, which will be based on the results available from your clinical trials. And then there will be 4 criteria assessed by DHS. The first one will be the DHS will evaluate whether this is a life-threatening rare disease. So you will have to show some data based on literature reference, for example. Second criteria, you will have to prove that the treatment cannot be deferred, meaning that there is an urgent need for your patients, that we cannot wait for the product to be approved. Third criteria, there should not be other alternative available for the patient, meaning that this should be the only option available for your patients. And last but not the least, the innovative criteria. So you have to demonstrate that there is not only a new mode of action, as I mentioned, but also that there is an added value for the patients, and also compared to your competitors, for example.
Thank you, Adeline, for this clarification. So thank you all for your participation and attendance in today's webinar. As I said previously, the replay will be available on our website shortly. And we wish you the best in developing your products and accessing to early access programs. And have a wonderful day and or evening, depending on your time zone. See you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.